With black bears, the scat is full of berries because black bears eat lots of berries and all that sort of thing. With grizzlies, the scat has little bells in it and it smells like pepper. So that's the little tip on how to tell the difference between black bears and grizzly.
The Ready Life, into the country.
Hi, I'm Nick Meisner.
And I'm Lisa, his wife.
And we want to welcome you back to the Ready Life podcast, where we help you become as independent as possible for your basic necessities like water, heat, and food, and the power that we so often depend on for these things. And in today's episode, we're going to discuss probably the most commonly asked question that we've ever gotten after years and years of doing seminars all over the nation. We could just about bank on always getting this question, and it was, what about bears?
Lions and tigers and bears, oh my.
I remember one seminar in particular. My dad was talking to a couple of ladies. I think it was at an inner city location, and the question came up, what about bears? And I remember my dad, being the ham that he was, he leaned over towards them and he said, "They eat you." And then their eyes got as big as saucers, and then all of a sudden they started laughing, and it hit them that he was joking. He was making light of the fear that we so often have of wild animals. And often I think it's a lot of times the fear of the unknown, because for a lot of folks, if they're not used to being in the country in an area with wild animals and all of this, that's scary to them.
Yes.
And for folks that have grown up in the country around wild animals, it's the two-legged animals in the city that are scary to them. So it's kind of the fear of the unknown, I think. But we wanted to go through a few things that we think will be helpful to you if you find yourself in that kind of a situation where you are intimidated at the thought of wild animals or that sort of thing. I think this will help the tips that we're going to give you today.
That's right. The very first thing that I think of when dealing with bears is really just by starting with something called prevention. Mm-hmm. Prevention is worth so much when you are dealing with wild animals. So things like making your place as undesirable for bears as possible. Don't put food in your trash.
That's a practice we've made.
Yep. We compost it or dump it into, bury it or something like that. We've got a bucket that we dump stuff into in the kitchen. And then once it gets filled up, then we just haul it out and bury it in our compost pile. That was actually how I started a compost pile, was after we moved out here. Mm-hmm. We were having wild animals coming up and getting into our trash. And so I started just dumping our compost into a spot on our property. Yep. And eventually we managed to start a compost.
And as far as trash goes, keeping your trash in a locked up container rather than just having piles of it somewhere, because if you're not familiar with living in the country, the trash men don't come to the end of your driveway and haul it off. You got to haul it to a dump or a transfer station or something like that. So in the meantime, having, whether it be, I know some folks will buy a big metal dumpster that they can put their trash in over the winter and then haul it to the transfer station the next spring, or some kind of a structure or container, whatever, just something that makes it where a bear can't just get into it. That's going to help, because my experience with bears is that it's usually trash that brings them around.
They love the trash.
Yeah, food, trash, smelly things. That's often what they're after. Not always, but often. Mm-hmm. And, along that same line, haul your trash off as frequently as you feasibly can. I know we would sometimes, if the trash would pile up before we started storing it in a container, we would sometimes find trash bags that had been dragged into the woods And it was very interesting to see what they would go after. One thing in particular, at this point in time, we would occasionally have some of these silk milk containers, and they would
yes.
tear into those things and lick them clean. They loved those.
That was their favorite thing, like candy or something.
Right. It was really interesting. But gardens, it is true that a bear was sometimes interested in not so much your garden, but your fruit trees, and because they like fruit. Black bears are fruit animals a lot. And so, of course, locating your garden near your home is discouraging any wild animals, not just bears, from getting into it, because most wild animals, and this is the case with bears too, they're generally pretty afraid of you. And so when you locate your garden close and your orchard as close to your home as practical, it does a number of things. It makes it where the animals aren't as inclined to, you're kind of discouraging them from wanting to get in, but also it makes it where you see it and you're more inclined to take care of your garden, out of sight, out of mind. And the opposite is true too. If you're constantly seeing your garden, it's a lot more likely that you're going to take care of it. So multiple benefits there. And, as far as the whole trash situation, I think of an experience we had, we were talking about things that bears like.
Oh, yes.
Well, there was a time where we were making our own biodiesel, and so we would go to restaurants and get old oil containers from restaurants, the used cooking oil, and we would use that. But at one point in time, they had piled up the containers, and we hadn't gotten around to making, usable diesel out of them. And we went on a trip, and we came back, and it was gone. All of the, it was
oil.
like, I don't know, 5 or 10 5-gallon containers. And we thought, what on earth is going on? And we fanned out through the woods, and sure enough, there was one container, there was another, been dragged off. We could see teeth marks in it. They could smell, the bear could smell the oil on it. He sunk his teeth into it, drained the oil out, and probably lapped it up. And we joked that if that bear ever got near a flame, he'd go up like a torch. He was full of oil. So don't make biodiesel if you're having bear problems.
I do have to just interject here real quickly. Bears, like Nick mentioned earlier, bears are more afraid of you than you may be of them.
Oh, yeah.
And so most of the time, whenever we see a bear, it's usually the back side of the bear because they're racing off, they're scared, and they're running. The only time when they're not going to be running away from you is if they're protecting young, if they've got little ones, or if they just want to fight with you over the huckleberry patch. But most of the time, they're just going to turn and run.
Yeah, it's babies, that kind of a situation generally. I've had a lot of encounters with bears over the years, and I can't think of a single instance where the bear was being aggressive or was endangering me. Yes, it's possible, and we'll get to that a little bit later, but I'm just saying 95% of the time, it's as long as you don't surprise them. That's the other situation where it could get to be a little bit more sticky is if you surprise them. But anyhow, okay, so tip number 1 was about, prevention, that sort of thing. So now we're going to talk about perimeter protection. That's another facet of this. So what are some things that you can do for, let's say, your garden and orchard?
Well, definitely put up a good fence because not just the bears, but deer and other animals are going to be very interested in your garden.
So that's multi-purpose.
Yeah. So just put up a really good fence around your garden to start off with.
And an electric fence can be helpful for bears too, is my understanding. I don't have personal experience with that, but I've heard that, running a strand of electric wire around if you're having bear trouble, because bears can climb fences. And so that can help to discourage bears from climbing a fence to get in there and raid the apple tree or whatever. Another form of perimeter protection that I heard from an old logger is back in the old days, they'd have logging camps, and the bears would come around because they were not being very careful about smelly things. They'd be frying up bacon and all sorts of things, and all kinds of food scraps laying around that bears like in these logging camps of old. And so they would have bear trouble. And the old logger told me that what they'd do is they'd put ammonia inside of balloons and then smear peanut butter on the outside of the balloon, and they'd put those around the perimeter of their camp. And if a bear came along, smell the peanut butter, and they kind of like peanut butter, sink his teeth into it, pop, and get a strong whiff of ammonia in his nose, and that was pretty discouraging to him, and he'd often take off. So for what it's worth, I don't know how practical that is, putting a bunch of balloons, but if you were having a really acute problem, and for what it's worth, that's what an old logger told me.
Oh my.
So what's our next thing that we wanted to
Well, the
talk
next
about?
category is like defense situations when you're home or even when you're out and about camping or hiking in the woods, and you might encounter, surprise encounter a bear or for whatever reason. Anyhow, some of the ways that you can discourage, like Nick was
Got
saying.
the usuals.
Yeah, you
the
got
ones
the
that everyone talks about.
Yeah, bears tend to turn and run unless you surprise them. So avoid surprising them and make a lot of noise so that way there's no surprises. If I'm ever hiking out in the woods, I'm noisy. I'll sing, I'll play music on my phone, I will, chat with a friend or something, because just the knowledge that you're there, and you probably won't even see the bear.
And larger groups of people, of course, make
Yes,
more noise
make more
and
noise,
have a
so it's
larger
safer.
visual impact, all that. But you don't have to. I mean, we don't think twice about going out in the woods alone. It's not a big deal. It's not a problem. Is it possible that something could happen? Yes, it's possible I could get struck by lightning. But you can't live your life in a perpetual state of fear of something that is so unlikely to be a major problem. But, as far as making noise, the common thing I think of is people wearing bells.
Yes.
Every once in a while, see that on the hiking trail. Somebody has bells tied on their shoes. And, different strokes for different folks. But I personally think it's kind of a gimmick. But another thing that is very, very popular is the idea of pepper spray. I personally think that the capabilities of pepper spray are overblown a little bit. And that's kind of the security blanket for some people. They think that pepper spray has some kind of magical abilities. And I've even heard of some people thinking that if a bear was charging you, barreling down on you, you just squirt some pepper spray on his face and he's just going to be knocked out and he'll go flying over your head or something like this. It's maybe that's a bit of an exaggeration, but you get the idea. I do believe that pepper spray can be effective at close range, and if the bear is not all pumped up and full of adrenaline and charging you, if he's inquisitive, curious, that kind of thing, and it's getting to be a problem and you're getting concerned that he's getting too curious, that kind of situation, pepper spray could be very effective for that. Because, it's uncomfortable. If you've ever been sprayed with pepper spray, at least for humans, it's pretty debilitating. So, yes, but I say close range because pepper spray can only go so far. I've seen some of the advertisements on the bottles of how far it'll spray, and then you actually spray this stuff, and maybe in some kind of laboratory conditions, or if you have a tailwind or something, maybe it would go that far. But to be a meaningful kind of spray that you need to do the job, you got to be pretty close. And the other thing is you don't want a wind blowing towards you.
Yeah.
I have had that unpleasant experience. And
try and spray it and it just comes right back at you.
and if I'm spraying me and the bear at the same time, I think the bear is probably going to handle the pepper spray better than me. And so that could be kind of a bad situation. So pepper spray, yes, it can be a useful tool, but don't feel like it's this, magical thing that's going to solve all your problems.
The other challenge with pepper spray, and I learned this when I was a senior in high school, we were in bear country, grizzly country. So we all had pepper spray cans. But I remember one time one of us young, brilliant students got the idea to go and just, try one out. And no surprise, the bear spray had been around for a couple years or more. I don't know how old they were, but anyway, yeah, it didn't spray. It just went kind of this jelly, weird, awful stuff that wouldn't have done us a lick of good if we had been in a situation where we were faced with a grizzly. So
rotate it.
Yeah, if you do use bear spray, be sure to check it and rotate I think it's every year you're supposed to switch them out.
That would be a good idea. In fact, here's what I would recommend. First of all, if you're anything that you're going to use, whether it's pepper spray or firearms or anything that you're going to use for personal defense, you really need to get training and practice regularly. And that goes for pepper spray too. A lot of people get the idea you just get this can and, it's like spraying a can of Windex. And, but there's training involved. If you want to be able to do this under stress, you've got to train with it. So here's the suggestion that I have for you. Get a new bottle each year and use your old bottle for training.
For practice.
For practicing.
And make sure that you're standing where the wind is blowing away from you.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. As with most things, it's hit and miss. And like I said, I think it's going to work best when the bear's just curious, not necessarily angry. By the way, speaking of pepper spray and bears and all of this kind of thing, it can be very useful to be able to tell your bears apart because black bears are a very different animal than, say, grizzlies. Most of you are not going to have to worry about grizzlies because they're not in a lot of locations in the continental United States. They are here, but only in, specific
small
locations
pockets.
And not very many of them usually. But one of the best ways to tell the difference between black bears and grizzlies is by their scat. And so with black bears, you're not supposed to laugh. I'm just giving it away. Okay, here we go.
Try again.
With black bears, the scat is full of berries because black bears eat lots of berries and all that sort of thing. With grizzlies, the scat has little bells in it and it smells like pepper. So that's the little tip on how to tell the difference between black bears and grizzly. And there you can understand why I laugh a little bit about bells and pepper spray. So
it's kind of the joke in grizzly country.
Okay.
But in all seriousness, black bears can be brown also. So just because a bear happens to be brown in color doesn't mean that it is a grizzly.
Yeah, it's the hump on the neck and the length of the nails.
And the face. Just go learn the difference between the black bear and the grizzly.
If you're in grizzly country.
Yeah, if you're in grizzly country. But otherwise, don't sweat it. The bears are going to run for the most part.
And I'm not quite sure what I would do differently, because even if it is a black bear, I'm going to be careful. I'm going to give them a wide berth, You don't want to run from them if you meet them on foot. And I have met bears on foot. You don't want to run, but you don't want to keep coming towards them either. You want to slowly back away and give them some space, give them a wide berth. But as far as like the last resort, in bear country, very common last resort is a firearm. If you're, and my opinion on that is that the best, if you're just looking for a close range bear stopper of a charging bear, that kind of thing, I think the best short range bear stopper is a 12 gauge shotgun with slugs, with rifled slugs. There's just, that's a large chunk of lead And I think that's one of the best options. As we mentioned with pepper spray, especially the case with this, you'd want to get some good training and practice. This is not something that you just buy it and stick it in your backpack and, whatever. This is something that you're going to have to be actively involved in. I think it does have a place, and I think that it can be a very helpful tool in a last resort situation. You're most likely never going to need it. I never have needed it, but it's
kind of the umbrella principle.
The umbrella principle, that if you take an umbrella, you're probably not going to need it. But if you don't take it, you're probably going to get rained on.
Get soaked.
Yeah. So one thing I would say is mount a light on it, because if you had difficulties after dark, if you didn't have to deal with it, then stay in the house. Why go out there? But if for whatever reason you found yourself in a situation where you had to deal with a situation after dark, having a light mounted on it would be super helpful, because you have to be able to positively identify something. And if, as far as rifles go, a heavy hunting rifle like a 30-06 or larger could work, as well also. But I still think a shotgun with slugs is probably the best option, because you got to have something with enough power to actually stop the charge. The thing you got to realize about bears in a defensive situation is when they're pumped up with adrenaline, they can even have a mortal wound and still keep going for a little while, just with the adrenaline pumping through them. And so you got to have something that can actually disable the charge physically, where they can't keep running, that kind of a thing. Yes, a lot of people do carry a pistol in bear country, and I'm sure it's better than nothing, but I just want to be realistic about the capabilities.
Yeah, if you're going to do something like that, you really need to make sure that you're well practiced, because
you got to hit them in the right spot.
Because you got to know what you're doing if you're going to do that.
Yeah, and that's beyond the scope of this podcast,
that's right.
Getting into all of that. But the smaller or less powerful it is, the even more important it becomes that you hit in the right spot. And that would be
don't want to make them matter.
Yeah, that would be especially so with a pistol. If you do have a pistol, buffalo bore makes, I think, the best option for outdoorsman load that can penetrate enough with a bear. And hopefully you're never going to need it. Like I said, I never have. And I'm trying to think if I know anybody who has with a bear.
Personally.
And I'm not sure if I do. So that gives you an idea of how rare this is. But I do think there's something to having an aura of confidence that animals can smell fear.
Yes.
And so while you don't want to be careless and think that you're Superman now because you have this gun or this can of pepper spray or whatever, I do think that those tools can be helpful in a situation like this to give you something that you can do where you don't feel like you're helpless and defenseless, and that can help to shut down the fear and all of that. And, obviously we're Christians, and this goes without saying that you're going to whisper a prayer to God and ask for your guardian angels to be around you. And that's certainly the best way to deal with fear. But there are physical things that we can do. And God, I believe that God expects us to do our part. And,
That's right.
Just like I buckle up in my car when we go on a trip. And yes, God is able to protect me in case of an accident. And we pray every time, for him to protect us if we have an accident or anything like that. But I still buckle up. And so it's kind of the same principle. We're going to do the best we reasonably can and leave the rest in God's hands.
Yeah. And speaking of confidence, if wearing bells on your clothes or your shoes makes you feel confident, that's going to go a long ways in giving you that lack of fear. Like, animals can so smell fear. They really can.
That's right. So now we've saved what I think is the best for last. If you do nothing else, if you were to only do one thing, then here's what would be my recommendation for dealing with bears. And that's to get a good dog.
Yep.
That is hands down the best thing that we've done. We had regular encounters with bears before we had a dog. Since then, I think maybe once or twice, maybe.
Maybe. I'm trying to remember. I can't remember that far back.
And I think it's when she was young and still learning the ropes. But you get a good dog that's, sizable enough to back up its bark with bite. Not that the dog is necessarily going to fight the bear. It's just that bears are generally scared of dogs, and not just bears. We're talking any of your wild animals. The dog is an incredibly multi-purpose part of your homestead. It's not surefire, but it's, I think, the best part of prevention and perimeter protection and defense. It's really all three of those packed into one lovable bundle. Yes. It's just, I can't say enough about having a good dog. You want a dog that has defensive characteristics, where it's not overly aggressive. And we've done a podcast episode on dogs.
We did.
We like German Shepherds. If it's from the right parents and if you train it up properly. But yeah, I think there's nothing better that you could do for a dog. I mean, for bears or any issues with wildlife than to get a good dog and train it up to be watching over your family. And
That's right.
It's just a great option. And, like I said, last but not least, don't forget about human effort plus divine power equals success. So at the end of the day, do the best you can, use good judgment, make prevention to prevent issues with wildlife and also to protect your family from problem critters, because occasionally there are critters that do things out of the norm. But once you've done due diligence, you can trust in God to put his hands of protection around you. And so there's no reason to fear walking into the woods. I remember I was walking around with a gentleman one time who had not spent time in the country, and it was after dark, and something happened, and I walked into the woods for something, and his eyes were as big as saucers. He said, you just walked into the woods after dark. And this was a full-grown adult man, and he was scared to death of going into the woods after dark. And I guess I would just say, yes, I get it. It's the fear of the unknown, but just realize that we do the best we can, but enjoy God's creation.
Yes.
Don't let this fear, don't let unreasonable fears hold you back from getting out into the woods. And at the end of the day, I would much rather be faced with our four-legged animals than your two-legged animals in the city. So, bears are generally not a problem unless someone makes them a problem. And even then, you can make your home a hard target and where they'd rather go somewhere else. You're much more likely to have issues with something more innocuous like a skunk or gophers or something like that.
We need to do a podcast on gophers.
That's right. So anyhow, I hope this has been helpful, folks. We'll talk to you next week again. And until then, take care.
Bye.
Bye now.